Look, these negotiations are going nowhere. If months of bombing and hasn't brought the Iranian regime to its knees, these are people, and I think this is what's difficult for President Trump, who's a deal maker, to understand, is they're not interested in a deal. We don't have a whole lot of economic leverage. Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries on earth.
Welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Amy Kellogg, joined today by Anja Manuel, who has got a big bio, and I'm going to winnow it down as best I can. She's a former diplomat and advisor on U.S. foreign policy, and together with former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, runs a strategic consulting firm. She's the executive director of the Aspen Security Forum, which is the premier bipartisan forum in the United States for dialogue on foreign policy. She serves on several tech boards and is an author. Anja, welcome.
I'm so happy to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with Canada, because that's the headline on this Monday. The U.S. is in a trade war with Canada, which is our, to the popular imagination, a mild-mannered neighbor, but more importantly, a very important trade partner. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, and who is to blame for the state we're in now with Canada?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Amy. This is great. I've really followed your work for a long time, and you're one of our exceptional journalists, so very happy to be with you. Yeah, it's not great to have a trade war with your closest friend and neighbor. I do think underneath the surface, I think the headline you're referring to is today, the U.S. implemented 50% tariffs on about $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. That sounds terrible. It's actually only 5% of total Canadian goods exports to the United States. And I was recently, we're going to talk about the Aspen Security Forum. Jamieson Greer was there. I interviewed him on stage, and I got to spend some time with him and some of his very senior leadership there. My sense from talking to them and from behind the scenes is that the U.S. Trade Representative and the White House wants to reach a deal with Canada and Mexico. I think they understand how critical this is to many of U.S. industries, especially the car industry. I mean, it's really one integrated industry all the way through. Condi Rice, my business partner, always says, after 9/11, when we had to shut the U.S. borders, within 3 days, no one in America could make a car because the supply chains are so integrated. And I think in the last 25 years, that's become even more the case. So behind the scenes, there's lots of conversations going on. You see that Mark Carney has moderated how he talks about the U.S. a little bit. And the negotiators are there. They're there constantly. And I think all three sides want to make a deal here. And when you look at kind of the nitty gritty, they're talking about the really painful trade details, softwood lumber and dairy and all of those things, which all of that makes me cautiously optimistic that we're going to get through this and we're going to get to a new updated USMCA.
Well, that's positive. I think the last thing we need is another war right now with Iran ongoing, with Ukraine ongoing. Let's talk about Iran, because today Scott Bessent announced that it's D-Day, economic D-Day. And he said that this is the single greatest financial offensive ever marshaled against an adversary. The point being, it's time to really squeeze Iran economically to try to resolve outstanding issues. Do you think this is going to work?
No. Look, these negotiations are going nowhere. The Islamabad memorandum had a 60-day deadline. It lapsed on August 17th. No deal, no extension. No one can agree on who's even in the room from the Iranian side or whether the deal or the deadline existed in the first place. So we're not in a good spot. And Secretary Bessent, I'm sure, is trying to scramble together new sanctions and secondary sanctions, but we don't have a whole lot of economic leverage. Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries on earth already. You know that. Along with North Korea. There aren't a lot of good options left unless you really force the United Arab Emirates, which is still a big trade partner of Iran, even though Iran's been bombing them now for months, Turkey, and China to really act on this through the threat of secondary sanctions. I think it's going to be, they'll probably exert some pressure on the UAE, some on Turkey. With China, the president wants the next meeting with Xi Jinping to go well. And as you know, China is buying most of Iran's oil and everything else, so, and supplying them with weapons or precursors to weapons behind the scenes. So I think this is more of an announcement than it will be real. We don't have a lot of leverage.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the UAE and some of these countries who trade with Iran and who profit quite heavily from Iran, and the thought that they would fall in line on this because it hurts their own bottom line is difficult to imagine.
That's right. Or they may do some, but not go far enough. I mean, if months of bombing and hasn't brought the Iranian regime to its knees, these are people, and I think this is what's difficult for President Trump, who's a deal maker, to understand, is they're not interested in a deal. These are, I mean, you know this so well, Amy, these are complete fundamentalists. The Iranian regime has gotten even more hardline since we killed the previous leadership, and they don't care about the well-being of their people, right? You can maybe imagine, look, the IRGC owns about 40% of that economy. 40% of zero is zero. So maybe at some point farther down the line, they come to their senses, but I don't have high hopes for this economic D-Day in particular.
I got kind of sad reading a quote from Iran's president, Pezeshkian, this morning saying, "We have stood firm and are trying to be servants of our people." I just thought, what people, what servants? The Iranian people are in dire straits, and apart from all of the security issues we worry about in America, in the West, in the Persian Gulf, there are these Iranians who've been sort of thrown under the bus by all sides.
That's right. And that story has gotten a little bit lost as we worry about interceptors and bombing people to the ends of the earth and what's left. This started in January with an enormous uprising where, depending on who you believe, 30,000 Iranians were killed by their own regime. And there was some lip service in the beginning by the American administration to say we're helping the Iranian people, but that is certainly not how it's turned out so far.
We've got so much to talk about, Anja, with Ukraine and many other issues. I want to ask you, before we run out of time, what you took away from the Aspen Security Forum, which happened, I believe, last month.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for asking about that. So this is a bipartisan foreign policy conference that I lead every year. When I took it over, it was pretty domestic. It was mostly Americans would come. And we've intentionally, in the last 5 years, made it much more international because Americans need to hear from the rest of the world. And so this year we were super proud. We had over 50 countries represented, almost 30 ambassadors, 30 countries represented on stage at very senior levels, cabinet level or similar. And it was in the middle of the World Cup. And the atmosphere was wonderful because I think the world is hungry to talk to America, to have America have a rational foreign policy. We did have also a very wide range of political views from the U.S. represented, and I really appreciated that, and I think people really appreciated to hear from really the MAGA right all the way to the left, to the Democratic Socialists. And we need to all get on the same page. And we had really good discussions on stage as well as off stage. So thank you for asking about it. And I hope you can come next year.
Me too. Did the Trump administration snub it? I read a headline about that somewhere.
So last year, I used to be on the board of the Pentagon. I'm not anymore. I don't speak for the Pentagon. And traditionally, we would have, 15 or so Pentagon representatives. They all wanted to come last year. They were told at the very last minute by Pete Hegseth that they were not permitted to, like on the day of the conference. And this year, again, The Pentagon was not permitted to participate. And I'm going to continue to hold out an open hand. We need this conversation. I know lots of senior leaders there who want to participate, and they have a good story to tell on a lot of areas. Some where we challenge them, some where they're doing great things, like on innovation. And so we'd love to hear from them.
Living in Europe, as I do, Anja, I hear a lot of anger about tariffs, about Trump's foreign policy generally, and I'm wondering if your experience at the Aspen Forum showed something different. Are leaders really looking at things in a clear-headed way and looking for solutions rather than feeling kind of desperate about all the rhetoric that comes out of Washington?
Yeah. I think when I talk to European friends, both at Aspen and then folks I'm friendly with who are in government across European countries, they are deeply angry and they feel betrayed. That's understandable. And also, I think behind the scenes, you're starting to hear, well, this was a message that was delivered in an ugly, bombastic way, but on NATO, it's something we had to hear. And by the way, I tell our European friends, President Trump says it in an ugly way, but every president, Democratic or Republican, is going to say it's time for Europe to take care of its own defense and to do more. And behind the scenes, I think people understand that in Europe, and it's actually going to help Europe be stronger, and it's going to ultimately help the alliance be stronger. So I think that's a real positive. The tariff issues I follow less closely. Look, I don't love that we have big trade wars with our closest allies, but European countries are protectionist. You live there. And the US for a long time has been the least protectionist great power. And also there, it's surprising because the Republicans used to be the free traders. There is now a huge coalition that is from the far left to the far right that thinks America has been taken advantage of by being so open to trade to the rest of the world. And so I think no matter who's in power in the United States, you're going to see slightly higher tariffs. You probably won't see this extreme back and forth that you're currently seeing, but creeping up from an average 2 to 3% tariffs, which is what we have, to an average 10% tariff would not be the end of the world. And I think that's kind of where we're headed, no matter who runs the US government.
It's hard to understand exactly how it's all come out in the wash, because some people will say, oh, the United States has raked in so much money on these tariffs. Other people have said, well, Americans are paying the tariffs because they're paying on the goods that come from abroad. So it's a little bit, I find it hard to get a general assessment or a general idea about how it's really worked out for the United States. Yeah. Okay, I want to switch to Ukraine. Today, as we're recording, Monday, is Ukraine's Independence Day, 35 years of independence. Yeah, but
hard fought.
Yeah, still being fought for, but someone pointed out that a third of that time they've been under attack by Russia. The UK's new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, said that Ukraine has been Europe's protector, not a drain on our security, but the front line in keeping Europe safe. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I think, let me be a little bit nuanced. The Ukrainians deserve so much credit for their bravery, for how they have stood out, for how they have created the world's most sophisticated and novel defense industry basically out of nothing. I mean, it's just amazing. We're all going to follow what the Ukrainians are doing after this is over. We'll talk about that in a second. Are they the front line of defense for Europe? They are, in the sense that Putin was going to keep causing trouble as he's on his way down. He just wants to tear down the international system with him. All of Russia seems ready to end this war, other than Vladimir Putin. When you talk to people, it's just super depressing. Where I think sometimes European leaders go a little far, and I'm not sure that the Prime Minister was saying this, is Putin was about to overrun all of Europe, except that the Ukrainians stopped him. I think maybe there's a little bit of nuance there that's sometimes lost, but certainly the Ukrainians deserve an enormous amount of credit for taking on this foe that was completely unnecessary, but who seems totally fixated on reconstituting the great Russian Empire, which includes Belarus and Ukraine and maybe a few other independent states. So
I find it extraordinary that the Russians continue to harp on this Nazi theme that they use for Ukraine. I see that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has said that a ceasefire would allow the Nazi metastasis to spread from Ukraine.
Right.
I don't know who's buying that at this point. I suppose some people who have been brainwashed by the propaganda, but it's to me extraordinary that this line continues to be propagated.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you're seeing, Russia now having trouble recruiting. They're losing more people than they can recruit. You've seen that there are now these horribly cynical ads out in Africa. I was just in Africa. Come to Russia to work. And what it actually means is you're going to be a mercenary and get thrown into the fight against Ukraine. So, and I think there's a point. I mean, you know Russia so well, Amy. It was only the poor kids from Dagestan that were being recruited. And at some point, that's not going to hold out, and you're going to have to recruit some people from St. Petersburg on Moscow, and then what happens? I worry. Well, I don't worry. I think there's no near-term prospect for a negotiated end to this, but there's a possibility that the Russians are exhausted enough that Putin will allow the pace of combat to diminish dramatically, and you end up with kind of a stalemate and a frozen conflict this fall. That's really unsatisfying when that happens in the international system, but we've seen those kinds of things hold. It's holding in Korea for 60, 70 years. So that's deeply depressing. But the Ukrainians, as you know, they're out of anti-ballistic missile defenses, but they've done enough damage inside Russia that they've caused an energy crisis. And so I think maybe you can come to a stalemate this fall, which would be better than what we have had.
I want to divert a minute to Africa, Anja. I didn't realize you'd been there, and I'm just wondering if there were any impressions.
I was there on holiday, but yeah.
Well, okay. But I do know that there's been concern that the closure of USAID affected a lot of countries in Africa in very critical ways. At the same time, I've also heard certain diplomats say that the vital medications for HIV are still being delivered. So I'm not going to pin you down on the effect of the dismantling of USAID, but I'm just wondering if you had any other impressions from being in Africa about the direction of travel, about anything that's going on there that would be of interest to our listeners.
Yeah, you can pin me down on USAID. That is $50 billion a year that the United States spends. That is a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket of how much we spend. We have $1 trillion defense budget. If you count intelligence, it's way beyond that. So this is peanuts compared to what else is going on. USAID has never been a well-run institution, and a lot of reforms had to happen. And every Secretary of State, Republican and Democrat, has tried to find some ways to reform it. Reform, I'm all for. Stopping doing what we are doing in the international system and basically leaving a huge lane for Chinese and Russian propaganda to say, look, the Americans are abandoning you, is outrageous. It is foreign policy malpractice. And so what you're seeing is behind the scenes, there's even a couple people in the current State Department who are trying to rebuild some things, and they're doing a good job on the margin. But DOGE just did a horrible thing. And I think the hit that the United States took politically for that was outrageous and a total own goal. So I hope we can come back to our senses.
Back to Ukraine for a second. Andy Burnham, the UK Prime Minister, was there. I saw images of the Finnish President, Alexander Stubb. It's always glaring to me that there are no images of President Trump in Ukraine. You'd think after all this time, and with so many other Westerners having flocked there to show some solidarity, that he would consider doing it, but it seems like it's not even on the cards.
Yeah, that would be great. But more than the president showing up in Ukraine, what we need is American arms in Ukraine. Those actually quietly flowed for a long time after the Biden administration ended because those contracts were already in place. Now it's running out, partly because of an ill-timed and ill-conceived war in Iran that nobody needed or wanted. We've all talked a lot about interceptors and things. But quietly, well, not even quietly, I mean, you saw Zelensky and Trump meet recently, much more positive things, some things that are a little bit pie in the sky, like the Ukrainians now have a license to build their own Patriot missiles that'll take 3 to 5 years to really come to fruition. But things are moving. President Trump likes a winner, and Zelensky looks like a winner. And I think the people around President Trump who were really whispering Russian propaganda in his ear have quieted. And so I have hope that quietly behind the scenes, the United States will do what it needs to do to help the Ukrainian people. And it's okay if the president doesn't show up there. It's just important that we help.
Your business partner, Condoleezza Rice, has said that it's important for the U.S. to win the war in the AI sphere. I'm not quoting her correctly, but she feels it's important that the U.S. is predominant and remains predominant in that sector because a lot is at stake, and if a country that has less scruples or less, say, regulation, maybe is a better word, becomes the front runner in the world of AI, we stand to run into an awful lot of trouble and danger. What are your thoughts about that and about kind of the latest AI issues that maybe our listeners are not totally versed in?
Yeah, it's certainly important that the values of the West, and that's not just the United States, it's democracies, are embedded in this really important technology. It has become quite clear in the last 6 months that there's no winning the race for AI. With what's happening, I don't want to get too technical, but there was this sort of, who has the biggest LLM? What's the race to artificial general intelligence? I think those voices have quieted a little bit because what's actually happening is about 10 companies, some American, some Chinese, maybe one French, UK, are racing towards a technology that is extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily beneficial, and very dangerous. And we're very rapidly getting to a place where I worry that in the next 6 months, we're going to have a Chernobyl or a 9/11, call it what it is, of AI in the cyberspace. Those models are getting so good at cyber attacks that the American companies that I know that have used them in a sandbox are deeply worried. We're not prepared for that. We're not really prepared for what happens when AI starts helping with chemical weapons development, bioweapons development. Now, 99.999% of AI uses will be positive and peaceful, and it's great that this technology exists. But we need so much more conversation with the Chinese about this. I was really encouraged that the US government is going back to something that actually the UK started under Rishi Sunak and is thinking about testing just for these national security concerns, the most advanced models. Now, by the way, that testing shouldn't happen with just the American models. Should happen with the Chinese open weight models as well before you let them loose on all of our systems. That should be universal pre-deployment testing, 1. 2, the Trump administration is now open to speaking to the Chinese, and there's a track 1, like a government-to-government dialogue that's happening in a couple of weeks. I am part of what's called the Kissinger Dialogue on AI with the Chinese. We're meeting this coming weekend. And I can tell you from previous sessions of that the senior Chinese leaders who are involved with this technology think pretty similarly to what I just described here. They're worried about the negative uses. They know that there needs to be some agreement. But right now it's a little bit like how we were doing on nuclear weapons before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I just hope we all come to our senses before there's a crisis that brings us to our senses.
The midterm elections are coming up, Anja. Everyone's talking about that, not only in the United States, but around the world. What is your sense of where the Democrats are in terms of their messaging and any lessons they might have learned from their defeat in the presidential election?
Yeah, I'm a foreign policy person, not a domestic policy person, but I, of course, live here. I worry that the Democratic Party doesn't yet have one cohesive message and line, and that's, this country is very divided right now. It's actually, I spend a lot of time, Amy and I, you and I were chatting about this before. I spend a whole lot of time in the middle of the country, and when I give talks on foreign policy, I try to do it with audiences that aren't so steeped in this. I haven't met a crazy person yet on the left or the right. People just want schools and roads that work and police that is there but that isn't too brutal. People want normal things. And I think what you hear in the Twitterverse and with the chattering classes is you have these extremes because you have the extremes on the left and on the right because the system isn't working for everyone. And until the Democrats have a message that says, hey, we're going to help all you people that are left behind, I think it's complicated. I mean, it's looking very clear that they're going to win the House, which is great. The Senate is looking more difficult. That's really a positive thing. It's time to have the opposition party really back. And I do think you'll see some, well, maybe. I'm hoping that as you have some changes in the Trump administration, which inevitably happens halfway through an administration, that you get kind of more thoughtful, moderate leaders in the Trump administration as well, rather than the screamers. But I worry about the U.S. system.
But I think it's interesting what you pointed out, Anja, about how in the heartland of the United States, you don't encounter the extremes that seem to be out there, who may really be confined to the world of media, social media, the media overall, which has splintered into very many different shards, as has been said. So it is hopeful in one way that Americans want things that are basic and normal and not...
I think we're all exhausted, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Can you just govern already? Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the cost of living issue is no one has the crystal ball, or no one has the magic solution for that, and the disparity between the rich and poor. Anyway, Anja, you are a foreign policy expert, and I really thank you for this conversation and your take on what is going on in the world. I hope we can do it again. Thank you so much.
I hope so too. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.